Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Ideamarket podcast once again. This week, I'm joined by Sam Barton, who is product lead at Ideamarket, and we are joined by Matt Pirkowski, author of Matthew Pirkowski. Is it mattpirkowski.com?
MatthewPirkowski.com. I think I have both, and they probably redirect to the same location.
MatthewPirkowski.com, memetics extraordinaire, writer on capitalism, decentralization, NFTs, crypto, value, a topic called distributed valorism, and a mass of extremely interesting and prevalent and important ideas. So we're going to be covering a lot of stuff in this, but hopefully it should just be a relaxed chat, which I see as sort of almost revolving around the tenets of capitalism in a way. But we do have a special opening Ideamarket question for you, Matt, which is, if you were to design a course or a boot camp, as they're now called, the purpose of which is basically everyone who enters that course comes out the other side as a clone of yourself, what would that course look like?
You mean sort of a clone of myself on that one dimension that the course is addressing?
The purpose of the course is basically just to create clones of you.
Oh, Jesus. Okay. This, I guess, is an interesting, what's your background question?
Yeah.
So, I've actually thought about this from a number of angles. And one of the most important angles right now is actually that of parenting or educating one's own progeny. I'm going to be a father here in, a number of months. And I've been thinking a lot about what it looks like to sort of establish the foundational principles, the first principles that allow for someone to actually effectively perceive the world. Most people don't take long enough to really think about the fact that our perceptions and what we learn, the ideas that we hold in our mind are actually lenses into the world and actually filter what we find to be important or unimportant around us. And so therefore, I've given a lot of thought to what are those foundational lenses that have shaped my own perceptions as I've gone through the world? And upon reflection, what are the perhaps distinct opportunities I've been given throughout my educational and professional background that have allowed me to see certain things differently, or perhaps prioritize certain signals in that noise of the communication landscape that we have today that aren't perhaps the typical signals that are focused on in education or in the professional world. And a huge one of those early on in my educational background was evolutionary psychology and understanding the emergence of humanity, human culture, human society from the world of biology, and attempting to think through what the implications are of humans actually having this sort of continuous emergence out of this space of evolutionary constraint, and trying to understand at a really deep level. There's always this question that is kind of in the common knowledge domain of nature versus nurture, but I got very interested in this idea of nature and nurture as this mutually informing feedback system, right? And we don't have to necessarily look at it through the lens of a dichotomy. I mean, yes, there's a tension in that feedback system to some extent, but this mutual information of sort of biological tendencies that are selected within the domains of animals far beyond humans. But then, how do those give rise to this degree of freedom that we've created in terms of culture, this increasingly expressive domain of language or money, or all these symbols that we're able to use to reflect back to ourselves meaning that is riding atop this biological infrastructure. And, we can dive into that further in our conversation, but I think unpacking that, was something that was very crucial to my early education, something I would focus on quite a bit. There was a class in college that was Sex, Evolution, and Human Nature. And I think more than any other class I've ever taken in my life, that Sex, Evolution, and Human Nature course that built up from the bottoms of, what is the function of sex in terms of allowing for various patterns of behavior to be selected for or against, showing how evolution then kind of almost turns that into technology and explores all of these various behavioral niches using this technology of sex in many different ways, and then understanding how that informs human nature, human customs, human systems, human technologies atop all of that. And so, if there's anything that my course would focus on at its center, it would be that platform from which to build the rest of our perspectives and understandings of what we are, how we see the world, how we interact with each other, our epistemic platforms, how we know, what we think we know, the limitations of that knowledge. But it would all start at that core of emergence of what we consider humanity from life itself.
Mm-hmm. So your course would begin basically with limitations. You say, look, here's our constraints, here's our evolutionary constraints, here's possibly our psychological constraints. Let's see where you go from there. I'm interested to see. So you obviously beginning from the evolutionary question of. So
can we pick just one thing there? Limitations. This idea of constraint is interesting because of the fact that it's easy to think of it as limitation, but and maybe we can get into this later as well. But some of the most promising, I think, some of those promising outlooks on this concept of emergence have much to do with instead of addressing it as a question of something more than was there, like the whole being more than the sum of its parts. That idea creates a lot of philosophical or logical problems when you actually try to understand where that more comes from. And there are some very interesting explorations of this concept of emergence that are really entirely constraint focused and actually understanding life and complexity and increasing complexity of manifested behavior as a reduction of the absolute number of possibilities. And so we tend to think of constraints as inhibiting or limiting, but I think actually some of the most promising visions with respect to the future of understanding emergence have to do with seeing constraints as the primary enabling factor of all complexity and order on Earth.
Mm-hmm. Well, evolution is just a process of sustainable and selected constraints in that sense, right?
Yeah, or selected constraints interacting with one another to create patterns that are recapitulable or regenerable, right? That can essentially recreate themselves across time and that have some sort of function that increases their stability or performance that is selectable, right? Which is interesting because that ties back into that question of evolution and what actually is visible to selection. And, ties back into this question of sex as a technology because sex as a technology actually increases the selective visibility of the kinds of recombinative patterns of these constraints that actually generate behaviors that are desirable within some context and across some horizon or some time at some characteristic time scale, which is another really interesting problem. And, we can get into that maybe, especially with respect to this conversation we want to talk about in terms of money and in terms of economic communication, because, that question of time scale and what we're actually selecting for and how the different facets of our economic behavior have their own characteristic timescales, and often those characteristic timescales interfere with one another in terms of priorities. Right? It's kind of like this question of, well, are we optimizing for the needs of today? How many people are optimizing for the needs of today versus the limitations of seeing into the future by a week or a month or a year if 80% of society can't see past today because their needs are not met today? The tensions of all of those different timescales interacting at once. So, yeah, all of this is deeply interrelated.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm just sorry, Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, just to jump in there, seeing how constraints actually maps onto some of what we'll come to talk about in the further on down in this conversation. Would you say that you kind of see constraints as limiting the space of potential action? I generally think about it like a tree. Like you need to limit the space that you can kind of grow in order to achieve higher levels of freedom. So a tree can't grow in all directions at once in order for it to achieve a certain to achieve a certain level of, let's just say, height, but at certain amounts of freedom, things that you're free to achieve. You must constrain the landscape of potential action so that you can kind of go in that direction. And just an analogy, like bringing this to societies, like we must limit people's freedom to only drive on one side of the road, or not to murder, or to do certain things, so that we can live in a world where we have access to healthcare, and where we can build things like Large Hadron Collider. Like, we must constrain the space of potential actions so that we can achieve these, what you could think of as freedoms. Does that map onto that?
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, there's a whole domain of people exploring this. I mean, there's a philosopher, his name is Terence Deacon. There's also some biologists, theoretical biologists, Monteviore and Massio, who have been doing a lot of work on constraints as a enabling aspect of biological organization and emergence. Stuart Kaufman has done a lot of work on that as well, in terms of this idea of constraints enabling work cycles, which directly relates to what you're talking about, in the sense that, think of how a piston works, right? Like, we look at a lot, we tend to focus on the schematics of sort of the fuel and the combustion, and that combustion driving a piston and the piston driving work, but there can be no work without the restriction of the piston, right? And what is the piston doing? The piston is ensuring that certain degrees of freedom are not explored by the gas in question as that gas explodes, right? It's reducing the overall degrees of freedom, or where that gas can go. And that is the fundamentally enabling reality of what allows for that work to occur. And philosophers like Deacon, they take that fundamental thermodynamic idea and they actually build from there certain ideas of other kinds of cognitive constraints, thought as what he calls something he labels teleodynamic work, right? This idea of being able to internally within our own minds allow for the manifestation of certain cognitive systems that constrain one another. And in that constraint, this is what we call thinking. We're able to do this kind of purposeful mental work. He builds all the way up from that fundamental level of thermodynamics, into this, through the levels of thermodynamic systems interacting with one another and constraining patterns to create complex yet permanent dissipative systems, like a whirlpool, for example, right? This idea of like a whirlpool being a process that has its own dynamic constraints, but it's not necessarily anything that you could point to easily from a perspective of what is there, right? Like, this is exactly why it's hard to understand emergence, because you say, what is that whirlpool? And what's actually happening to produce it? And you can't actually say that in any static sense it exists without the entire system around it pushing energy through some set of constraints, generating a pattern that is performing this dissipative process of essentially facilitating entropy overall while producing order locally. I know, Sam, that's something that you're quite interested in from a number of angles. This question of entropy and information processing as a generator of order in the world, and it's another deep principle that deserves much more study and much more widespread knowledge and consideration.
Yeah, and I think that'll probably fit into our discussion on capitalism, which I think James might lead us into. But I think it's when you start digging into these things, it gets pretty hairy in a way, because it's just, they're connected to everything. It's and that might sound trite, but it's the truth of it. When you think about energy, information, freedom, constraints, you can't pull apart. I guess what I'm trying to say here is you can't pull value, or you can't extract value or tease it out apart from the systems that we're describing. So, how do we act in the world? How do we do so how do we do that on an individual level and at a collective level? Like, value, what we should do is inextricably connected to an understanding of how these processes come to be and develop and evolve across time.
Yeah, I mean, we are we're restricted to having this conversation using words, and we have to use this word we call value, and then we have to identify, well, what are we talking about when we're talking about value? And that question isn't necessarily isolated to the 21st century and the people on this planet right now. This idea that we get to somehow define what this word means outside the context of the continuous evolution of behavior that's given rise to us is a strange idea. So then the question is, well, how does the term value connect to that history? And it seems like at the most generic level before you want to get specific in terms of different people's perspectives on value. It has to have something to do with those behaviors that enable us to keep this game going, that enable us to actually survive as individuals or as families or as communities or as societies. There has to be something in the process of interaction and relation that we find valuable, right? Like we have to see value in light of the fact that we want to keep this game going, right? It's unclear to me that if we were an entirely nihilistic society, that you could even have a concept of value, right? Because the concept of value presupposes the concept of desiring continuation. And so, I think I begin with this notion of, well, how do we understand value from the perspective of our interactions with one another in light of the fact that we're all part of this much larger inertia through time and space of some process of humanity increasingly complexifying its interactions that enables this tension, or that it's like this dynamic tension. In a lot of my writings, I talk about this tension between individual autonomy and collective agency. And that's always there, regardless of the scale you're talking about. Whether it's a family and there's the individual autonomy of any member of the family versus the collective agency of that family itself, right? Like not every family member can do everything that they want at every given point in time, while the family could, in theory, act coherently. Like, let's say you want to go on a road trip as a family, right? That requires a certain amount of collective agency, because if one family member at a pit stop sees a butterfly and wants to chase it forever, for example, it's going to interfere with the collective agency of the family to actually go where it wants to go and arrive at its destination. And that's just a very simple example, right? But like, think about our deep questions of political liberty, political freedom of speech, right? This idea of what is the collective organism doing when simultaneously it's trying to balance each individual's ability to explore reality and pursue some sort of path that is of interest or value to that individual, while simultaneously attempting to balance all of the ways that, as those different interests integrate or fail to do so, the entire collective must retain some amount of coherence. And why does it need to retain some amount of coherence? Well, it's interesting from the current perspective. I mean, think about someone who's extremely upset with the way America is going right now, yet doesn't necessarily want to find themselves in 10 years under the regime of the CCP. Well, that's kind of interesting, right? Because to some extent, our collective agency is the only thing that shields us from some other collective entity with high collective agency, coming and actually exerting dominance over our space and the processes that we've developed here across history. And so, this tension between collective agency and individual autonomy as an informational adaptive process, right? Because the abstraction of the collective can't get information. It can't make decisions as an abstraction. It all has to flow through individual units of intelligence, right? Like these are what's kind of called the terminal units in most complexity theory kind of perspectives on the world. It's like the units where the rubber meets the road. Like in your circulatory system, that's your capillaries. It's where the actual blood cells, the actual hemoglobin, the actual red blood cells is able to actually give oxygen to the cells that need it, right? And then actually return to this circulatory system and actually become part of the higher order flow that oxygenates it again. Or if you're talking about a political system, it's individuals who are living their lives, but then contributing information with their votes. And that information is aggregated at a slower cycle of collective agency in terms of that democratic mechanism. Or if you're talking about the sort of Hayekian perspective on the economy, every transaction of two terminal nodes or two agents is providing a piece of information about the relative worth of something, which across the entire population, this price signal emerges. And that price signal can be used to effectuate more collective agency in terms of allocating resources to a given process of whatever the price signal is talking about. So, that's another deep pattern that has to do with this question of value. And I think, when we use this word value, we're pointing to all of these processes and all of these tensions. And whether we know it or not, we embody that, we act that out with every decision we make and everything that we decide to pursue or not in terms of our sort of scope of preference and value.
Just to jump back a tiny bit, just to pull some threads together in relation to what we've been talking about so far. What is your sort of psychological leaning? Because it seems so far that it's, in relation to value decisions, and then in there is memetics in a way, this idea of, a memetic rivalry or memetic decision. It seems that your psychological basis has a leaning towards sort of behaviorism, or would I be wrong with that?
I wouldn't see myself that way. Like, I understand, like, I think that it's not that I don't value the insights of behaviorism, because I do think that from it's the information one can glean from an extrinsic analysis of agents and their behavior is useful. Like, there's information, right? But it also omits the entire internal domain. So I kind of look at that as, you're omitting all of the underlying emergent processes that give rise to that behavior, and you're just saying that we can reclaim, or you could think of it as saying, if you were to be a pure behaviorist, and you'd kind of make the claim that all emergent evolutionary behavior has been a kind of compression algorithm that is lossless and can be decompressed via close observation of behavior, right? You can reclaim all the information necessary from the external observation of the bottom-up process and its behavior visible from the outside. I don't think that is entirely true. I think that there's some amount of information, a high amount of information, that can be reclaimed from close external observation of behavior. But I think the entire world of phenomenology, the idea that part of what's happening at every moment is the interaction of a particular frame of reference, a particular path of emergence through the world, and that's interacting with what is so-called objective reality and making meaning out of that constantly, is an insight that we have for too long in the modern age overlooked. And I think it's just now gaining traction. I think, unfortunately, it mostly gained traction initially through the sort of postmodern lens of philosophy, but I think that there are more productive ways of looking at phenomenological insights and understanding that, to the extent that we can talk about objective reality, what we're talking about, are the slices of the world that are of sufficient permanence and stability for many people with many values and many perspectives to come to those experiences and still have shared overlap, right? And that's a slice of the world that's really meaningful, around which we have to cohere, I think, for us to be able to do anything as collectives, right? Like, we can't entirely be in our own worlds linguistically, or with our own symbols of value. We can't have an entirely solipsistic and entirely self-centered and self-contained perspective. We have to communicate, because we are each partial. We each only hold one thread, right? I mean, this is an age-old idea, like the story of the men, or the philosophers, or the sages and the elephant, right? Like, each puts their hand on a different part of the elephant, and it's only through dialogue that they could even theoretically realize that they're touching an elephant. Otherwise, they're going to think that they're each touching some different type of creature or different type of thing. And so, humanity has known this for a long time, that each of our perspectives is partial. But I think for quite some time, the Western canon has leaned so heavily into the idea of the objective, with good purpose. It's made a lot of progress there in terms of manipulating the external world, but it also biases away from a much deeper understanding of how each of our own paths through the world impacts what we perceive as valuable and how we contribute useful information to the table. And in a world where we're now increasingly tying every individual together in real time at the speed of light, we need a much deeper level of insight into that latter set of ideas, into this notion of how we do integrate these perspectives, even if those perspectives are in theory not always in alignment or agreement, right? And this idea that there's an absolute truth, it tends to produce a lot more friction and heat because it creates the frame of reference that every conversation should in theory converge to a singularity of truth, a singular point. And that singular convergence process, if that's your assumption, if that's your axiomatic idea coming into a conversation, as opposed to the idea that like, actually maybe we're holding different perspectives around the same object and we need to stitch them together. And we're never going to agree that we see the same thing, but what can emerge out of our conversation can be a better or more accurate picture of the world. Like that perspective, I think, is something we need much more of in the world today. This idea of exploring disagreement as co-discovery of why it is that we differ, what it is that we value, and the fact that evolution and adaptation has actually conserved many of those different perspectives and values as a sort of pluripotent mix of potential that can be brought forth in humanity at any given time based on what the needs are of our situation, because those needs change over time. I think that's a really core insight, which is another reason why I think this idea of teaching through the lens of sort of adaptation or evolution and emergence is so powerful, because it does, you can't assume that you can just discover a truth, put it on the shelf and forget about it. From the perspective of evolution and adaptation, you understand that the niche in which you're adapting or evolving, or the landscape upon which you're evolving, is constantly changing based on the actions and reactions of every other agent on that landscape. There is no such thing as being able to have a fixed perspective forever, and essentially be able to categorize that as objectively permanent. Now, I know plenty of people will disagree with that in terms of talking about things like gravity or whatnot, and that's a much deeper conversation in terms of the way that we even talk about or represent patterns, such as mathematical patterns and physical patterns. But yeah.
Just to make something you mentioned there, I guess, a bit more explicit, and to make sure at least I'm understanding what you were saying about the plurality of perspectives within, you could say, like the human social organism. You're saying that what I was taking from that is that we have conserved in human populations a variety of different perspectives which are somewhat innate, which cause people to see the world fundamentally differently. And it's only through the collaboration, it's through the communication of these differing perspectives that we can achieve what you could say, a more accurate or a more truthful representation of what is actually going on. When it's truthful being like asymptotic, not 100% truthful, but like developing a model together through dialogue that is a better representation of what's actually going on. And then it's actually fundamentally necessary for these divergent perspectives to exist in order for us to achieve that a more accurate collective map. So liberals and conservatives, that might be making it far too simple, but they are like it's the terminology that we use. It seems like from the psychological literature that there is something innate about these political leanings, that there is something that we are born to lean in a certain direction, regardless of the environments we're exposed to, just by nature of our constitution. And that is actually necessary to inform or to enable us to navigate the world collectively. So I just want to make sure that that's kind of what you were getting at.
Yeah, I mean,
so that we're more on the same page.
That's exactly what I'm getting at, and it's interesting because of the fact that it occurs at multiple levels of analysis as well. You have the encodings of this kind of diversity of perspective at the level of what psychologists call personality, right? These are multiple dimensions that we've shown to exist in pretty stable ways throughout people's lifetimes. Speaking to what you're talking about with respect to people's predispositions, right? That you're born with, not necessarily that these are fixed across life. They aren't. They can adapt and change based on what you lean into in your behavior. And if you're someone who, let's say, is extremely like high anxiety, there are things that you can do about that to change the natural predisposition across time. You can parameterize it. Now you're probably never going to move the needle all the way to the other side of that spectrum. But yeah, these are sort of, you could almost look at them as sort of initial conditions or like starting positions, right? And yes, within complex systems, right, there's this idea of sensitive dependence on initial conditions, right? So it's like if you have your dials set to a particular sensitivity initially, that's going to make you more sensitive to certain information in certain environments, right? Like if you're an extrovert, you're going to be more likely to pursue engagement with social environments. You're going to probably have more conversations with a wider variety of people. That's going to probably basically create a feedback mechanism where you're going to strengthen that resolve to do more of those activities. And across time, that's going to lead you to explore a particular slice of the world that an introvert is not going to be exploring, because the introvert is going to be spending their time perhaps perusing the depths of history or of philosophical writing or of computer games. Who knows exactly? But there are these low-level settings, and then there are at every single layer of our society, there are different elements of our culture that tap into that and reinforce those different paths. And so it's not to say that people with initially different settings can't cross over, or their paths can't cross, or they can't evolve across time. But it is to say that it's interesting to think about what it means that evolution conserves these different, not just perspectives in the way we think about it in terms of like, I hold a perspective. It's a conscious idea that I hold in my mind and can dispense with if I consciously choose to do so, but much deeper predispositions in terms of what we are sensitive to, what we are attracted to, where we find value, where we find threat, and how that, because of the nature of our lives and our paths through the world being this process of interaction and reciprocal feedback with different contexts, development of those paths across time has so much to do with the kind of information that any individual can then bring to a conversation or to a group or to, and this is what people, I think, in the best forms of conversations about diversity, let's say, and in the best forms of what that means, that's what we're talking about, right? That's what we're talking about when people bring the best of themselves that others don't hold to the table, such that we can collectively put that together and use that in a way that has never existed, and therefore create some sort of new perspective or new idea or new capacity. And that's extremely good. That's extremely helpful and useful and valuable. So, yeah, it's a deep question. It exists everywhere at every moment, and we're constantly engaged in this question of, how are we, what part of ourselves? I think this is an interesting psychological question. I think about this all the time myself. It's like, what part of myself am I bringing out through my actions? Like, if I get on Twitter and spend 20 minutes in a rage cycle on Twitter, like, what is that actually doing to my frame of mind for the day? Am I less or more likely to engage in the work that I find useful in the long term? Even if I try to engage it, am I less likely to actually have the sort of openness of curiosity and engagement and presence of mind, compared to if I had some sort of other morning ritual that was perhaps more orienting and calm and sane, right? And so it's like, and you can make examples like that of almost any interaction you have on a daily basis, because each moment in time is dependent on the previous moments in time. So it is worth conscious attention, I think, by every person who wants to live a conscious life and wants to live the best life they can live, to actually consider how each investment of each moment, emotionally, psychologically, cognitively, is shaping those future moments, right? The subsequent paths that they're going to take and the paths of those around them. This is our personal responsibility, I would say, and our responsibility to those we care about.
The risk of drastically simplifying capitalism, and also quite a clunky segue into the conversation of capitalism. The idea that you were speaking about of conflicting, disagreements and conflictions between people in terms of where we're going, what we're agreeing on, this idea of a single sort of teleology for any discussion, would you basically say that capitalism is one part of it, at least, is its importance as a social function, which allows basically to go, look, here's something which has proven something else, so somebody is right. So once everyone is within capitalism, or is under, however you want to phrase it, it's not a system itself, right? It's a non-system because it subsumes everything into it whilst still remaining capitalism somehow. So it's the system which subsumes the whatever into it, which it sort of deems as truth. So it's sort of a truth-finding mechanism in a way. Would you see capitalism that way, or am I completely off base?
I can totally understand where you're coming from, and I think that a lot of many of the patterns you're describing have much to do with what the image of capitalism is in most people's minds. I think the interesting thing, the hard part I have with this frame of reference of capitalism is that, historically speaking, it was initially created as mostly a pejorative. This idea of capital and this idea of capitalism was initially brought onto the scene as a mode of attacking those who were, let's say, leveraging money or capital as opposed to direct labor. And so I think this whole frame of capitalism is almost this interesting idea of a reappropriation of a term of denigration. Like this idea of there's an insult. This happens today all the time, right? Like, let's say there's an insult directed towards a community. That community will often take that insulting word, flip it, and start using it internally, rehabilitate it, and then change the sort of context from a negative to a positive, which is very much what happened with this word capitalism. I mean, these people who were being denigrated as capitalists, decried as capitalists, decided to say, well, okay, we'll be proud of this thing you're accusing us of. And so it's hard to talk about the nomenclature without talking about, this question of, well, when people were looking at the negative aspects of concentrating certain flows of resources and industrial processes, and they were looking at inequality, and they were looking at some of the more acute consequences of, I would say, feedback processes, right? And then they labeled it capitalism. Did that label really capture the depth of the pattern required to talk about the phenomenon in question? And I think my answer to that would probably be something like, well, the simple answer is no, because fundamentally what we need to understand is that, the tendency of our symbols to, the tendency of human symbols to incompletely capture underlying reality, but also be useful, and therefore create a sort of distortion between the symbol and the actual process is like, that's a much deeper process than 18th and 19th century industrial exploitation, right? The idea that if you create a representation of, like, let's say that you're operating 2,000 years ago and you're a king and you're responsible for the management of the farming in your territories so that your population isn't going to starve, right? And you need a way of representing which farmers have brought what to your grain stores, and you need to understand how many people you have and whether or not you're going to have enough grain where you're going to have a rebellion on your hands. You will then create some sort of symbolic accounting method, which is actually some of the earliest forms of human writing that we have on record. It's like essentially accounting methods. But not only do we have forms of writing on hand, we also have little, miniature sculptures that were placeholder representations for different types of cattle or grain. But then there's this interesting question that comes up, which is like, okay, well, as soon as you symbolize reality and then you put faith in the symbols, if the symbols are corruptible, there's a temptation for someone to take advantage of manipulating symbols or the fact that those symbols are concentrated to change reality in their favor, right? And so, like, these processes are extremely generic, and so capitalism is just it's hard for me to even know what's being pointed to, which is why when I wrote that paper, Crypto Beyond Capitalism, the rise of distributed valorism, I wanted to point toward this idea that, well, what we're really trying to get at is how we talk about and how we represent value, and whether or not the tools we've used to represent that value throughout time thus far are sufficient to get us where we want to go, given the increasing complexity of the world. Right? And I use these ideas. One example I gave in that was, consider stoplights. Right? You have a yellow, red, and a green, depending on where you're at in the world, light, and they're in a vertical column. That gives a certain amount of information to the drivers to tell them whether to stop, slow down, or drive. And basically, there's this question of how much information is carried to be minimally effective. And in theory, you could reduce the information by saying, we're going to compress this further because we don't want to spend the money on the different color lights, or we don't want 3 lights. So you could either say we're going to have 1 light that switches between red, yellow, and green, or you could say we'll have 3 lights and we'll just have blue lights, and it'll just be by position, right? Well, let's say you implement those blue lights by position. The information is there. If you understand what position the light is in, you could act appropriately. But the probability that you're going to have greater amount of accidents is going to be much higher. I mean, I think intuitively everyone can understand that forcing people to understand the position of the same color light relative to having numerous dimensions of signal, like being A, the position, and B, the color of the light, you're not going to have as effective of a signal, right? And so what you see over time with money, the reason I bring this up is because a similar process has happened with money over time, is that we've compressed all of these really deep complexities of human value and behavior into a unit of account that essentially provides one dimension of price for anything that is brought to market or any service that is offered. And, that's extremely efficient. It's a compression algorithm that's extremely efficient, especially because it can be mapped onto a single currency. So let's say that, you were in a pre-modern era and you had to bring all of your goods to market. If you had to negotiate in 20 different currencies at every moment, that's a lot of friction. It makes it much less efficient or effective in terms of having a marketplace that can function in an increasingly complex world. So we had this selection function that was really selecting for simplicity, fungibility of currency, simplicity of the signal in question. But that compression leaves out some information. Like, it compresses away information. Right? You don't capture all of the ways in which someone can value a cow through the price of the cow. You compress a lot of it in there, but not all of it. And then the question is, well, is there a point in time when the complexity of the world passes a threshold where the information that you're compressing out through a low dimensional price signal actually starts to matter, right? You actually need that information somehow. And then there's this question of, can you reclaim that information? Can you bring back out that information from this overly compressed price signal? And I think, when I wrote that essay, one of the points I was trying to make is that from the macro perspective, I see crypto and this movement that we're part of right now, seeing this explosion of all of these different price signals as a way of trying to understand, can we add new layers of information signaling onto these previously heavily centralized, heavily managed unidimensional price signals, such that we get a lot more information and a lot more pricing accuracy, even in the underlying single dimensional price, but we get a lot more activity going on and a lot more representational power around that, because we can actually use different cryptocurrencies to represent different dimensions of value that actually, going back to our earlier conversation, appeal to people with different personality characteristics or different perspectives or different histories or different, cultural considerations, right? The farmer in the Midwest is differently predisposed to which cryptocurrencies they might be interested in compared to the coder in San Francisco. And that's a good thing, because what that allows us to do is actually recapture information in that process of moving from perspective and action and the actual reality of an individual human being and their life and their behavior to the abstract signal of a one-dimensional price, and then actually have intermediaries where you can get information out of that process and do other things with other additional processes. One of which is what Ideamarket is doing, saying, there's a price signal associated with this typically unpriced good of people bringing perspectives to the table. In the current marketplaces, the current economic incentives, in the currently economically incentivized platforms that exist, what's the selection function? Well, the selection function is managed by a centralized company who's trying to maximize engagement to sell ads. They're not necessarily incentivized to select for the best ideas, because that would actually require them to have some idea of what the purpose of those ideas is actually working toward, right? And it doesn't care about that, because that's not what it's incentivized to care about as an economic entity. But Ideamarket could, in theory, bring that out of this content by having tools that allow people to understand, well, what are these ideas working up towards? Like, how do they stitch together? Who should be talking? What project should they be working on? All of these things are latent value signals that exist in people's conversations every day on social media and Twitter. But it's right now being sort of outgassed into the friction of conflict, as opposed to harness that has worked, right? And that goes back all the way to the initial conversation we were having on constraints, because it's all about finding the right sets of constraints that can turn that just general energy into useful work, right? And that has a lot to do with creating better signals around what information is worthwhile. So that was a bunch of stuff. I kind of went a few places there, but I'm happy to pull any thread or revisit any of that.
Yeah, no, you started and finished in exactly a place that I agree with respect to language is lossy, representation is lossy, and anytime we're representing something or communicating something in any way, we have to decide what to include and what to exclude, and there's nothing objective about that. That is a personal judgment. And if it becomes embedded in culture, then it becomes kind of a cultural judgment. It's not any one person responsible for it, but the same activity is happening. So there's, a really important evolution happens at the metaphor level, where you kind of switch lenses and switch stories, because each metaphor, each story inherently highlights and makes different curation decisions about the things that are getting excluded from the lossy mechanisms. Like we're not going to be able to communicate things perfectly in any foreseeable or imaginable future. But we're definitely at this sort of metamorphosis phase where the limitations of the old metaphors are really coming up against the wall of technological change. That we have all these new abilities and social and informational realities now that the model that has worked for thousands of years is not a good fit for, and just can't be a good fit for. And so I like the way you described Ideamarket as kind of pricing something that's not priced yet. Well, we haven't really had the technology to price these things before, but now not only do we have the technology, we kind of have the necessity, because the models of that existed before this technology don't work in its presence anymore. Does that kind of track? Is that kind of in the same vein as you were speaking?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Like that lossy compression is fundamental as an idea for people to internalize. I think it's also, there's this interesting question between also the idea of these lenses as choices, as conscious choices that we make, versus also just intuitive, unconscious or preconscious ways that we engage with the world, and tools that we can use to make us perhaps more consciously aware of those preconscious filters that we have in place. I mean, I'm constantly fascinated by this obsession people have with the political dimension of this all, right? This one-dimensional left-right spectrum. It's like, what would it be like to look at the world through the lens of, the opposite information bubble? It's like, well, okay, sure, but like, what about what is it like to look at the world through the lens of an artist, or through the lens of like someone who's interested or obsessed with math, or different types of minds in terms of the way that like I would love to have a plugin for Twitter that allowed me to sort of like go through like change the dimensions of personality, and then it would make different tweets like glow or something like that, right? To understand what is it that's attracting attention based on who you are, what you value, and not just this one-dimensional political game, because that's another thing that is so frightening to me about the sort of entrainment and the polarization game that we're playing, because the stronger we entrain with that single dimension of political polarization, the less information we're getting from all of the other possible dimensions of like perspectives in the world. Like all the other ways of seeing events are essentially being left on the cutting room floor, because the only perspectives that get amplified are those that have political utility as essentially weaponized mimetic ammunition, right? And like the idea that the only information we're sharing is that which is useful for mimetic warfare is not only is that just sad, but it's also, I would make the case that that's nowhere near as effective as we could be in terms of stitching information together for constructive purposes, for the purposes of actually building new tools, creating real progress on certain issues that people care about. I mean, like, it's a fascinating question. Like, if we were able to, like, the amount of energy and heat generated in this social media space, like, it's being harnessed for extraction. If it could actually be harnessed for sort of collaborative construction, the idea of what's possible there is quite mind blowing. I mean, it's really, that's the hope that keeps me going through a lot of this, is that maybe one of these days we'll sort of wrap our heads around how to turn this reactor, this mimetic reactor that we've created, from a super weapon into something that is actually a source of sustainable mimetic energy for driving people to sort of realize their better visions of the future, and not like push those upon other people, but actually build them themselves in their day-to-day lives, in the lives of their communities, like creating new tools of value, new processes of value, living out the lives that they're instead, I guess, just sort of projecting on others daily on Twitter. And I can't stand entirely aside from that, because I fall into the pattern myself from time to time. Not proud of it, but it's a powerful attractor.
Yeah, 100%. I think one of the hard things to do is figure out a way to make these changes without really requiring anything of most people, because a lot of people are struggling to survive. They don't have time to figure out like why this approach is philosophically superior or whatever. Like, there's kind of whatever a solution might be has to be a lens that can be installed on people's behalf, that they can just participate in or naturally gravitate toward based on the way you set up the environment. Like, if you have a highway, people kind of know, don't walk on that. You don't have to put signs everywhere saying don't walk on this because you'll get hit by a car and die. It's just kind of evident. And if we can design a social media atmosphere that makes better behavior or more productive behavior more obvious, more obviously reasonable, then it doesn't require people who are working 2 jobs and use Twitter for fun to relax in their spare half hour a day to like fuss really hard over new paradigms and shit. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah. I mean, I don't think, generally speaking, I don't think that change tends to, like, when you see something that's a paradigm shift, it rarely emerges with high energy on behalf of a large component of society early on. It's typically, this is just the adoption curve, writ large in terms of every phenomenon. Like, there are a certain set of people who really care or who are really into a particular idea, and they're by nature going to be more involved with that earlier. And then for the vast majority of people, it's only when, something like Ideamarket becomes embedded in something else they care about, maybe 10, 20, 30 minutes a day, are they going to interact with it? And I think that's fine. I think that's actually desirable, because the converse of that requires a lot of coercion. It requires you to force people to care about things that they might not otherwise care about. And I'm always a proponent of trying to attract good behavior as opposed to force behavior of any desired type, because that is in some ways this sort of natural selection function. If you can't attract people, if you can't attract anyone to the pattern you're advocating, there's information in that, right? Regardless of how ideal one might think it is in the long term, if there's no meaningful path to it that's voluntary, that's a signal that you lack information about the side effects of your model at the very least, right? Like the fact that it's so difficult to move people into that space is telling you something. And then, there are those types of people who don't want to listen to that information, right? It's a very common, these days that's very common. Right? This idea of like, no, our goal is 100% compliance, and anyone who refuses is going to feel pain, right? Well, what does that do? That creates a situation where, where that small percentage of people are going to become very, very active in ways that make the system even less predictable, that make it more chaotic, that generally move further away from your desired ends. It's crazy how these lessons have been with us for thousands of years, man. Like the Taoists had a lot of insight into this. Even like extremely abstract mathematicians, like 150 years ago, were talking about like the fact that ends to means reasoning. If you pursue a goal, even a small angle, once you get to that goal and you miss it, you basically create another goal to compensate for what you screwed up, and then you basically end up going in the opposite direction of where you thought you wanted to go over time. So it's like people have been trying to communicate the side effects, the negative and unintended consequences of trying to force change on those who are not ready for that change for perhaps the entire history of humans pursuing goal-directed collective behavior. But, yeah, it's along those lines. Maybe we should even get further into or open up like Ideamarket specifically and talk about how Ideamarket is attracting a certain type of people, and what those people, like how you see those people interacting with it as a platform early on, and what value that's generating around this space, and how those individuals who are identified as valuable on Ideamarket, how they might be able to also add value to the platform, or like leverage Ideamarket as a tool for them to come together or create more goods or services or projects of value themselves. I'm interested to hear more about that.
Yeah, well, the market is still at a pretty immature stage, and most of the activity that we're seeing is people buying things that they expect to blow up if the market blows up. Mm-hmm. So we're not seeing like the new paradigm like taking form in Ideamarket quite yet. It's really just about like mirroring the current status and information landscape, which is why Elon Musk is toward the top, and a Vitalik tweet is at the top. It's the slam dunk stuff. We're not at the point of surfacing undervalued genius with millions of dollars quite yet. But the ideas behind attract rather than compel are incredibly central to how this has been designed from the start. When I talk a lot about like psychological economics, that when new information comes, you're not just weighing, you're not just measuring the facts and say, well, which one is more true, and then I'll just believe the truth. Everyone thinks that's what they're doing, but actually there's all these calculations about social status and tribal allegiances and like who will I become if I believe X? And if there's a really high cost to that, then it doesn't matter how true it is if you're not willing to also pay that cost. So there's this kind of the decision about whether to believe something is kind of economical at its core. It's not as abstract and logical as it's often portrayed. And this is fine. Like, this is not a complaint at all. But what it means is, in order to create a greater concern for truth, we really have to shift the economics that goes on in people's minds. And what I mean by that is, right now, we're basically always deciding when we encounter new information, for example, on the internet, am I going to prioritize status more and like my reputation and my standing with my community, or prioritize truth and curiosity and like honestly whether I'm convinced by this or that more? There's kind of this continental divide. In the United States, the Continental Divide, I just learned this recently, is a spot in the Rocky Mountains that runs down continental America, where if rain falls on one side of it, it washes into the Pacific. And if rain falls on the other side of it, it washes into the Atlantic. And we kind of have this continental divide of the mind, where anytime new information comes, there's a line where on one side we care more about status and reputation, on the other side we care more about truth. And what Ideamarket aims to do is add firepower to the truth side by saying, here, you can make money now. We're adding economic incentives, financial rewards, the promise of wealth and status and influence to the truth side, so that continental divide of the mind just moves over a little bit like this, so that a whole swath of things that would have fallen on the status side now fall on the truth side. And it just, by shifting the inner economic landscape of belief and persuasion and convincing and discourse, we can, without compelling anybody, create more open-mindedness and curiosity where it would have been closed off before. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it definitely does. I mean, it's interesting. It brings up some fascinating questions about the social psychology around what it means to be seen as purveying truth versus lies in the contemporary landscape. I mean, obviously, this question of misinformation, disinformation, these are buzzwords that are widespread in our online landscape right now. And, it's this interesting, it's not easy to understand, given a piece of information, regardless of that, let's say that information could be known in terms of its true status, 100%. Even if it's known, it seems like we're existing in a landscape where if you put that information into the landscape, it's immediately distorted such that one side of a given divide will perceive it as truth, and the other will perceive it as falsity, almost irrespective of the underlying truth value. It's almost arbitrary in the sense that, if not for a few historical factors, an entire swath of the population could see an issue entirely differently, right? And on top of that, you have that strange sort of instantaneous polarization of the perception of what's true versus what's not true. We also have this question of anyone, this sort of guilt by association taken to extremes that we've never seen before, right? Associating with anyone who's even stated something that's not immediately reinforcing of a given team's perspective is now seen as this equally guilty or shameworthy as having said something yourself. So you have this sort of connection shaming game that's being played as well. And so it's interesting to understand how one might shift the landscape towards a frame of reference that can be outside of that, right? Because that continental divide you're talking about, the idea that there's one side of that is truth, depends on anyone on that, perceiving the world through that, on that side of the continental divide, not immediately or increasingly being caught up in this game of polarized information warfare.
Yeah. And maybe I can clarify a bit. I don't mean to say that like on one side of the divide is truth, but on one side of the divide is concern for truth. On one side of the divide is the ability to be convinced of a new thing. And on the other is, no, I'm going to protect my reputation no matter what.
So like, yeah, and like how, okay, so this is an interesting question just in general. I mean, maybe it's a can of worms as always, but this question of truth and, you know, the definition of like, I guess in terms of like, when you're making statements like that pursuit of truth, what is that? What does that look like? What is that value? Like, how does that value cash out? Like, what is truth in that sense? How do we like, what does someone pursuing that look like in their actual behavior in the world? Like, compared to someone who's out for status, someone who's out for truth does what?
Yeah, that's a good question. And
Mike, I think both.
it seems like
go ahead.
I do have something to suggest here. And I think what distinguishes someone who is pursuing truth in a particular area, because I do think it's area based. No one is completely rational or honest about everything. But I think what truth seeking kind of consists of is being willing to pay costs for it, because our ability to care about things is finite. And so anything that isn't about the truth is a competition with it. So in order to have the best information on a thing or to discover the truth about a thing, it's only really possible to the extent that we prioritize that over whatever costs might stand in the way, like pissing off your grandmother or losing some friends or becoming a different person politically or identity-wise or something like that. There are all these costs that, you know, emotional costs that have to be paid whenever we change our mind or become, you know, more informed about something in any meaningful sense. So I would distinguish truth seeking as that, as paying a cost, as being willing to pay costs for the sake of having truth as a primary concern or as a priority.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, for me, a lot of these ideas seem inextricable from concepts of, for example, trust, and the role that this plays in our ability to, you know, within our own lives, but especially in the social realm of people coming together and trying to understand where we've all come from, like what reality looks like today, how do we make sense of the present, and then how do we actually come together to plan for the future with any sense of continuity or certainty, right? Like this idea of stitching together past, present, and future into this kind of temporal map is an idea that I've been really interested in exploring in relation to trust. It seems to me that, you know, to trust someone is to be able to, without sort of enforcement, to be able to take their word for granted in terms of the fact that they're bringing to the table a high fidelity representation of their path to that moment, like their idea of the past, their representation of themselves, the world, and their intentions in the present, and then their intentions for the future, right? So, for example, like this essay, the example that I gave in, you know, one of the essays that I wrote in that Crypto Beyond Capitalism series, this notion of, you know, if I'm sick, right, and I actually just was sick last week, but like, let's say I can't go to the grocery store. Hey, would you be willing to take this, you know, this $100 and go get me some groceries, right? It's like, and if you say yes, we're at that moment in time, right, where the future is still ahead of us. And I depend on you, rely on you to say, like, I think I know who you are. I think I know I can trust you. I think I know you're being, you know, of high integrity in the moment. And then we're making this plan for our paths to diverge through time and then come back together with some set of agreements holding true, regardless of whatever temptations you might incur on the drive, let's say, to and from the grocery store. If you're going by the casino or I don't know what your vices of preference are, but the ability to avoid those such that that map that we've created together can actually maintain its integrity, and then by you coming back to that point in the future that we planned together, we reinforce the ability to be able to the next time maybe put a little bit more on the line and a little bit more on the line and a little bit more on the line. And I think all of society is actually this big process of us doing that together and building this very robust map of time and space together that we rely on as a society to be able to actually pursue any complex objective, right? And when I'm asked what I think this idea of truth is, because I'm much more on the sort of pragmatic side of the scale philosophically, it's like truth is the integrity of that map, right? It's like if there's this idea of gravity and we say gravity is true, well, why? Because we have an understanding of the continuity and the way that it affects things in a way that is so regular that even if someone tries to act against it, they're almost immediately met with an example of the fact that they are incorrect, right? Functionally, right? But then we created this space of language and representation, and then you get into this map territory question of representation of the world that's not directly associated with penalties or costs when you deviate from it. And this ties back into what you were saying about people paying costs, right? Being willing to pay prices for the truth. And I think what that means to me, at least, is this idea that you need to maintain a connection between our abstractions and the cost of those abstractions leading us astray such that everyone ends up paying the price for the damage that abstraction does to the temporal map of everybody if it's untrue, right? Because an untruth is kind of like a little bomb that goes off and blows a part of that map apart. And whoever depended on it can no longer use it. So
we're saying we need temporal map insurance. We need paradigm insurance. I completely agree.
I mean, to some extent, paradigm it's interesting in that sense, and we try to build redundancy, and this actually, I know one of the topics. This is like a direct segue, at least in my mind, to this topic of proof of work and proof of stake, right? Because I think that fundamentally what we're talking about when we're talking about proof of work and proof of work mechanisms is this idea of maintaining the kind of relationship to the world that physical reality has by default, but representational reality does not necessarily have by default, and can end up, therefore, allowing for people to move away from consequences increasingly in time and space, and then try to put those consequences on other people other than themselves, right? Like this is kind of like this parasitization question that I talk a lot about, which is this idea of like, to the extent that you can divorce your words and representations from consequences for some large period of time, you can gain value, short-term value from doing so. Like if I can convince you that it's worth your while to, or like in that example of going to the grocery store, let's stick with that, right? If you can say like, oh, actually the prices, I saw the prices, those prices are 50% higher than they were 2 weeks ago because of inflation. I need $150, and I'm not checking those prices, and I'm not going to the store, and I'm trusting you. If you can convince me that my mental model is wrong and yours is right, even though it's not, by words or images or whatever representations, you could take that extra $50, pocket it, give me the groceries. I'm none the wiser, but there's been this distortion of reality that you benefit, this local distortion of reality that you benefit from. And I think that like when we talk about the utility of mechanisms like proof of work, it's recognizing that we are always going to have this problem of representation versus reality, and it's ensuring that there's some mechanism to bring those back into alignment sequentially over time and check in with reality in a mechanism that can be trusted because it is resistant to the best attempts any nefarious actor would would make to corrupt it.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful distinction. Proof of work, the more I think about it, the more profound it seems in that respect, that it seems like an incredibly elegant metaphor for how reality kind of works, just actually. And there's just an infinite depth to that. And I think the comparison that you make is really cogent.
Yeah, I mean, I think like this proof of stake idea, or the idea of people coming together to agree on a hypothetical way of organization for a short period of time to explore a possibility, that's that's the other side of this coin. Like, I'm not denigrating the proof of stake side of things. Like, in fact, I'm writing something right now that's trying to demonstrate the deep symbiosis between those two perspectives. But I think people tend to see proof of work and proof of stake as competing for the same pole position, let's say, in this race or this infrastructure war. And they don't really recognize the role that proof of work plays as a binding mechanism between extrinsic physical processes and the human imagination, and the human imagination and the capacity for self-deception. Even in cases where that self-deception is positively motivated, well-meaning. It's a very fine line between good faith exploration of the unknown and parasitism. Like, I mean, back in 2017, 2018, people were criticizing ICOs a ton, and, for good reason to some extent. But one of the things I would say frequently was, just because snake oil is always sold on the frontier doesn't mean it's not the frontier, right? The thing about a frontier is that because it's an unknown area, the context for what the standards should look like have not yet been established. And therefore, yes, it will attract all of the parasitic actors, but it will also attract perhaps a smaller fraction of, but in the long run, a way more impactful contingent of people who are genuinely interested in exploring the frontier. And I think that to ensure that there's a sort of right relation or symmetry there, so that it doesn't go fully lopsided towards parasitism, you really need mechanisms that keep that attachment to extrinsic physical reality that's not subject to just the human machinations of the mind.
Do you have any ideas for how Ideamarket can do that better? Can tie, have some more extrinsic, connections? I have some thoughts on that, but maybe you have something totally different.
I mean, I think part of the insight that I've been exploring with respect to the relationship between proof of work and proof of stake is that in many ways, proof of stake is this exploratory pattern of hypotheses that are identifying certain sustainable or locally stable processes that could exist within possibility space. And then as people discover those, they can essentially connect to each other over time and become their own proof of work as they reference some sort of extrinsic part of reality itself, right? So, like, to some extent, what Ideamarket is trying to say is that, like, people are saying words online, and those words online have some theoretically positive relationship to helping us steer the future in directions we prefer as opposed to those we don't prefer. And so I would think that to the extent Ideamarket can show how it is facilitating the cooperation of people with high quality ideas, or helping to make some of those ideas more real, or helping those ideas influence actual physical processes, because that's where the rubber meets the road between ideas and the exploration of those ideas through physical behavior, investment, resources, people being willing to try on those ideas with the associated costs that they might bring, right? And so, Sam and I were talking about this the other day to some extent, where it's like there's the price signal, but then beyond just the price signal of the individual putting the ideas out, there's this whole ecosystem of what impact those ideas are having, how they're making their way through the mimetic fabric, how they're creating new social network connections and spinning off projects, whether those projects are succeeding or not, right? Like if you could show that there was one mimetic cluster that was actually outcompeting another mimetic cluster in the types of projects that were spinning off of it and the traction they were finding in the world, right? That's actually showing from a pragmatic, adaptive perspective that those ideas are capable of gaining more purchase in a functional context. Now, what that means is another matter of subjective debate, right? But it actually, at the very least, what's showing what making that visible does is increase the accuracy of pricing, right? At the very least.
Yeah, that makes sense. Did you and Sam discuss the rating system at all by chance? Because I think there may be some proof of work-esque aspect to that too.
I don't think we covered it in depth.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, not in depth. So I'd be interested to hear what you mean. You mean rating system beyond price rankings?
Beyond price, yeah.
Yeah.
So something we're going to launch in the next couple of months is something that has been near and dear to me for a while, and we've lovingly called it the blockchain of opinions. But it's really just a rating system. So an Ideamarket users will be able to rate URLs on a scale of 0 to 100 in order to express kind of a general sentiment without defining it too carefully. And what this will allow people to do is over time, we can look back and say, show me only the people who had this opinion about this topic at this time. And so it'll create this sort of memory, auditable memory of public judgments by anyone, basically.
Yeah, I wish we had that starting in 2019.
Me too. Oh man, that's always the example that I use. Show me the people who were right about COVID before February 1st, please. Like those are the people that that I care about right now.
There's so much history erasure and sort of changing of tune happening right now. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. So I'm hoping that will help create this sort of proof of work-esque, like almost a proof of prescience kind of thing, so that as history evolves and as opinions evolve and interpretations evolve, we can adjust our present day trust systems with reference to the history of the judgments made by the candidates for our trust.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm curious how is the quality of, so it's like you said this is a ranking system as well. So there's obviously some sort of you're saying a blockchain of these opinions that are expressed publicly, and then you're saying as well that there's some sort of quality metric associated with these, or ranking system associated with these. I'm kind of curious how you are understanding or looking at the evaluation process of the quality of an idea over time.
Yeah, so the ratings on a scale of 0 to 100 are free to express. It's just to create a record of what each person thought at time about topic, about URL. And I've been trying to figure out what the right approach is to defining what the ratings mean.
Mm-hmm.
Do we say this is unlikely and this is likely, in my opinion? Do we say this is something that I think is valuable or not valuable, or useful and useless? Like, how do you define the spectrum? And right now, our best idea, in my opinion, is to be deliberately vague about it. Mm-hmm. Basically have thumbs up, thumbs down, and let people interpret that how they like, without like trying to over codify things. Mm-hmm. Because generally it will be used in the way that it's used. And if we over codify it, then that lets people say, well, I thought it was useful at this time because X, Y, Z. It lets people kind of weasel out of it down the line. So we're leaving it kind of deliberately vague because the use will emerge and kind of have an unstated meaning. Mm-hmm. But the rating system is completely independent of the markets themselves. The markets are used to determine what do we want people to rate, That's the URL market. What are the topics and issues and bits of information that we think are really important to have judgment calls made about? And the other is the users. Whose opinion do we really care about? Who do we want opining on these things more than anybody else? So we use the two markets to kind of decide whose judgment we want on which topics. And then the rating system itself becomes like the filter that we can look at over time and see who's actually making the judgments that we find valuable in the light of history.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's like, I mean,
does that answer your question? Does that answer what you were trying to ask?
Yeah, I mean, like, yes. I mean, like, it opens up more questions, and it also, yes, does answer the question that I was. I guess it answers it to the extent that you all have explored this, right? I mean, it's an open space for a great deal of further exploration as we try to sort out this idea of how to make sense of opinion across time and how our perspectives on opinions shift over time as well. You know, it occurs to me that, you know, an opinion at a given point in time can be quite unpopular. And you might see that reflected in your votes at the time, right? And then later on, if that's shown to be correct, the popularity shifts. Obviously, you want to be able to capture that. There's some sort of semantic aspect as well, and I think you're referring to some extent with respect to how to measure this. It seems like perhaps the ability to tag might be useful in the sense that, you know, something might be like just generally dissenting opinion or insightful or intellectual or whatnot. Free-form tagging is interesting because it also lends itself well to sort of cluster analysis later down the road. Right? A lot of interesting questions about sort of the emergence semantics, especially now that there's so many endpoints for that kind of semantic embedding now kind of on the market that are increasingly accessible for analysis of sort of semantic meaning. You might be able to just figure that out from people's words, though, without allowing for tagging. But yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to think about what it means for sort of, because there's the question of primary prediction, and then there's also this meta question of who's like how people are evaluating the quality of prediction, right? The second order quality question. The quality of the evaluators. So perhaps someone's not a very good predictor, but they're actually really good at evaluating other people's predictions, which would be a kind of a strange position, but maybe it's a thing. I don't know. I mean, I'm very fascinated to see where this goes. I think that just in general, accountability mechanisms are extremely necessary right now. This idea that as our technology encourages us to generate more and more information daily and kind of erase our memories as we go, we develop a sort of free float. It's another form of free floating relation to the underlying territory, right? The idea that we generate a culture that is increasingly lost in its own exhaust, so some like intellectual and verbal exhaust, and like doesn't actually check back in with reality, or doesn't even necessarily any longer have the tools to check back in with some extrinsic reality. Like, if we wanted to, how would our society even do that right now? Right? Like, if we're so deeply entrenched in this polarized perspective, this game of political polarization that distorts and lenses every piece of information, how do you even get back in touch with something outside of that? Right?
I think we're seeing that right now. I think we're seeing the battle for the frontier of checking back in with reality happening. That every splinter tribe is, has their own little flag of it. And, on one hand, like, we'll see what the extrinsic reality turns out to be down the line, kind of gradually. And on the other, the first place I would look is the most outcast, low status people and groups, because the more you have to lose, the more likely you're going to prioritize saving that thing instead of losing it in order to figure out what's really going on. So Ideamarket is kind of designed to help orient people toward those low status, crazy fringe things, because the emotional economics of that are the best. And that's why all the best information is on 4chan, and where all the crazy low status, anonymous, primordial ooze of chaos. That's where all the best stuff is. And it's right next to all the worst stuff. But there it is, though.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's fascinating that at every layer of society, if you study much of history at all, especially the history of science, you pretty quickly come to realize that it's extremely difficult to bring a novel idea to the table, especially when it's correct. It's like the strangest paradox, right? Because you think that if an idea is new and correct, it should find receptivity amongst those who are most qualified to bring it into the sort of domain of truth, right? This idea, this ivory tower of those who are, in theory, elected by society to maintain the boundaries around what is true, what is real, what is not. And in theory, we would expect for those people to be receptive to truth, to novel truth. And in reality, what we see is that the human tendencies, like as you're talking about, these social tendencies, these tendencies to protect their territory, to maintain claims to status that they've earned through advocating perspectives that might be undermined by new models or new findings, that tends to dominate in the short run. In the long run, reality always wins out. In the short run, the human machinations and tendencies and all of the games that we play for status and all the competition that we have in terms of like trying to acquire resources personally, like those dramatically distort short-term perception of truth, right? Especially around novel findings or novel explorations. And I think that what y'all are doing is, in many ways, trying to accelerate that process by actually having seeds of signal, even in the short term, that can help orient people towards quality, emerging quality, or the quality of emerging signal, even though that's new and all of these status games and social shame games are being played around it for people's own local purposes. If Ideamarket can help establish track records and establish the integrity of those who are analyzing the quality of these signals, then we can help facilitate and steward that transition process from emergent signal into like new paradigm or newly acknowledged reality or fact or truth. You can accelerate that, and I think that acceleration is absolutely necessary in today's world that is operating at such higher speed. And if you don't have something to help steward that truth into the wider consciousness and actually demonstrate that it does have value, even though those who have something to lose might be decrying it as misinformation or disinformation, we're at risk of losing that information more quickly than ever right now without a technology or system like that, I think. So.
And I'll just add to that it's we're not only at risk of losing that information, but we are the trajectory that we're faced with existential threats if we do not develop the capacity to integrate information into, like you could say, collective knowledge and then act based on that. If our capacities are increasing, if we are getting increasingly powerful and the impacts of our actions are felt faster and faster, if we lack the ability to identify a signal and then you could say integrate it and amplify it and then act on it, then we could actually face the collapse of societies. Because if the map of the world that you're working on is just completely at odds with reality and you keep acting based on that, it could lead to disaster.
Yeah. I mean, the more complex the territory, the quicker the map is useless, right? And so it's like the more complex the territory, the more it's changing every moment, and the better tools you need for making sure your map is staying in touch with reality, but also for updating, for making sure it's staying in touch with reality by having solid processes of updating that map consistently, and then also not just updating the map, right, but also deciding to do about the map, right? And then sort of the trajectory of how things are updating, which is also a fascinating question, right? I just read Neil Stephenson's new novel, Termination Shock. I don't know if anybody has read that as well or is familiar with it. But it is, I mean, it's interesting. One of the fascinating things I really enjoyed about it was this interesting exploration of, it's near future. It's basically a book about the geopolitics of climate and the geopolitics of countries trying to understand what the implications of any political actions are going to be. And then also the fact that if someone were to just start taking action, what would happen then, right? So like, I don't want to give too much of the plot away, but someone, an American, starts taking certain actions to specifically and sort of in a high leverage fashion, bring down the temperature. And it sets off this chain of events with multiple different geopolitical actors and nations. And, this massive race is on to model what's going to actually happen and occur and flow from this change. And then people, who don't like the specific outcomes, like there's this tension that he supposes in this book where it's like many different models have lots of different outcomes in their variants of how climate change is going to affect any specific location. But it seems to be that there's a trade-off typically between China and India, like the monsoons in India versus like crop sustainability in China seems to be a recurring theme in all these different models. And so it's like, well, what happens even if you have intentions that are good and a high quality understanding, you are still left with trade-offs between geopolitical actors that have a great deal of power in the world. So that's one interesting thing, because I think part of it is having a high quality map. Like part of it's truth, and then part of it's this age-old question of, given truth, there are still tensions and still questions about what to do and how to act, and what our ethical imperatives are as humans and as societies. But yeah.
I feel like we always get down these sort of discussions when it comes to idea market related things. It's just always like, oh, it's about finding truth, but then it gets straight into moral philosophy. What should we be doing? That's kind of where my mind goes, and it's just like you pull on the thread of idea market, and you're suddenly just ensconced in philosophy.
I mean, I think you guys are
sorry
doing
about
that. You guys are doing a lot. Well, it's not. I mean, the world wouldn't necessarily be a bad place if people spent a little more time thinking about moral philosophy. I don't think. I mean, we obviously can't spend all of our time thinking about abstract questions. And you guys are creating a real product, and that's going to have meaningful impact in concrete terms. It's just always the case that when you're talking about topics like truth, there's a cycle of abstraction in abstract reflection and then concrete implementation, right? And it's always interesting or useful for me, at least, to keep in mind that no matter how high quality map we have, so first of all, pragmatically, it's worth having a good map. But also, no matter the quality of the map, we're still left with certain perennial questions and tensions that are as old as humanity itself. And so I think that sort of helps ground us. For me, I care a lot about trying to avoid utopianism when it comes to sort of any project or any trajectory, because it's like we have to know our limitations and to some extent have faith that what we're pursuing is going to manifest as best as it possibly can, given that what we're pursuing is in line with a set of ethics and virtues that we hold locally. So,
yeah, 100%. And I want to make clear, if I haven't, that one of our kind of guiding principles from early on was to thoroughly admit defeat in the quest to define truth or decide how everyone should define it. Like we're trying to make that question not relevant here, because the system that we've had recently is kind of about creating assemblages of facts, finding a bunch of little certainties and stacking them on top of each other. But since uncertainty is far more fundamental. We're trying to build something that starts from that and acknowledges that and builds in a healthier relationship to that uncertainty than the pretending it doesn't exist model, which is kind of the facts model. So yeah, I just want to echo what you're saying here and underline that we're really not trying to define truth, but build rails for a relationship to it that's based on a map of its actual fundamental uncertainty. Does that kind of make sense? Because I really don't want to come across as so arrogant as trying to define truth in some new way. That's really not what this is about. It's just about encouraging a relationship to the process of truth preference, of truth valuing, without any kind of prescriptiveness about what it entails in the end. Like one of the main reasons we're using markets at all is because we want to honor the subjectiveness of the conclusions. That to whatever extent, if whenever someone finds certainty, the next step is always to try to enforce it on other people. And at the end, the ground reality of all truth seeking is personal judgment. Have you seen that Ouroboros that Scott Alexander put on his blog a while back? That thing changed my life. I don't even really read Scott Alexander that much, but the Ouroboros, where he has like personal opinion, expert opinion, scientific study, randomized controlled trials, meta-analysis, and then it feeds all the way right back into personal opinion. Like that thing, that is the essence of this. Like we have to keep personal opinion as like the foundational kernel of our truth-seeking mechanisms, or you're just going to end up with some kind of tyranny. So I just wanted to harp on that a lot, because this is by no means an experiment in defining truth once and for all. It's an experiment and completely giving up on the notion, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a commitment to attempting to identify and sort of upregulate in the social consciousness high fidelity functional representations of reality. Right? Like we can say something like that without even going near this word truth. Right? Like we can just say the representations that we are, like, to some extent, we want to be on the side of representations that allow us to actually work sustainably with the world and increasingly build these shared projects with each other that rely on the capacity to coordinate and communicate and actually do so across larger and larger groups that, whether we like it or not, are now connected across the world. Like we can't, well, not that we can't perhaps, but it's difficult to imagine disconnecting everyone at this point, right? Short of some sort of catastrophic events. So then the only question is, well, given that everyone is now connected and that connectivity of every single human mind has thrown us into somewhat of a state of chaos and is making every single set of mental models that we each hold in our mind subject to a great deal of examination, scrutiny, and friction, how do we come back to a place where we can constructively stitch those back together without trying to annihilate the representations that others hold in their minds? Like we need not, like this idea that we're so fearful of other alternative representations of reality. Like it's very strange to me, this need to destroy others' representations of reality if they don't accord with our own, seems to communicate such a deep fear of the fact that we don't, right? A deep fear or deep insecurity about our own models, perhaps, right? The existence of other models seems to imply the incorrect nature of our own. And I think that, again, that's a legacy of this idea that truth must converge to unity. And I don't think that that's true. I think that fundamentally this word truth is much better seen through the idea of coherence, how multiple different facets of perspective can actually functionally come together to enable productive, cooperative, and competitive interaction in a way that is sustainable and adaptive across time. And if we see it in that way, doesn't, like, the fact that someone else looks at the world differently from ourselves does not mean that we must feel insecure or pursue the obliteration of their perspective, as we see is so common today. And I think anything that can help us realize that or facilitate that process is something that I want to help flourish in the world. So I'm really happy to see that y'all are pursuing a goal like that, and I'm happy to help in any way I can.
Awesome. It's fun just chatting at this point.
Yeah.
I've been shutting you guys out. James, you haven't spoken in like 40 minutes. Yeah, got anything?
I don't know. Well, I enjoy not speaking. It's quite fun.
Okay, well, no pressure. No pressure. I just want to provide space. But yeah, and regardless of the character of truth, there are things that we can't help but do. We have so much time, we have so much attention and effort to spend. Every college student goes, why am I here? What am I going to do with my life? That is a resource allocation question. And everyone asks it. It's like, it's not optional. And on a society-wide scale, on a global scale, we have the same questions. What are we going to decide is important? What are we going to do? What do we think is true? These are all really kind of resource allocation questions. We can choose to prioritize things and deprioritize other things. And without really coming to any conclusions about truth as like a philosophical notion of justifiable certainty or anything like that, if we can improve the results of our resource allocation, our non-optional resource allocation decisions, that seems useful. That seems like it might provide some benefit. So it's a big experiment, but
yeah. I mean, and that manifests over every dimension of life. It's like this idea of what are the quality of our actions. I mean, that's another key theme that I explore quite a bit, is this idea of the quality of an action, right? This idea of a trade-off often between time and quality as well, right? This notion that we need to understand that those those resource allocation decisions that you mentioned, those happen at every scale of our lives, and they, for the quality of the decisions that are occurring at the highest orders of scale, the quality the quality of decisions being made by our governments, for example, for that to be of sufficient quality. And I'm a firm believer in the idea that the people within that nation have to be living high quality lives. I mean, I think that our politics are in many ways a trailing indicator of the quality of our culture. And the culture is a trailing indicator of the quality of the lives that we're living. And I think in many ways, I mean, this is why it was very difficult for me to see Trump as anything other than a symptom of a culture that had been obsessed with solipsistic reality television and representation over substance for 20 years or more, at least, right? And to scapegoat him and to look at him as other, as opposed to see a reflection of our own culture and our own cultural priorities in him, is, I think, an unwillingness to look at the shadow of the past 30, 40 years of what we've done to our own lives and the priorities and the choices that we've made and the way that we've decided to live. The fact that we've become so enamored with the representation and the narrative over the actual individual engagement with physical reality, right? Sitting on a couch and passively consuming life as entertainment, as opposed to getting out there yourself and actually engaging with whatever part of this world you find meaningful, such that you can develop a high quality relationship with that slice of reality. We lost a lot of that. And it's time to get it back. It's time to actually re-examine what our priorities are, what a high quality life means, what high quality relationships mean, what high quality, education means, what high quality comprehension of information means. That's where you guys are helping. I think personally, as someone who looks at the world from an emergent perspective, I don't believe that those decisions that emanate from these higher order abstractions, these political abstractions, I don't think that they will ever reach satisfactory quality until we ourselves increase the quality of our own lives, our own communities, and the processes that we live out daily. So,
yeah, that's awesome. I may have missed some of the intro, but I'm interested to hear how how you're personally handling some of these questions and what you're engaging with right now as an extension of this same kind of feeling.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things. Like my life has changed drastically over the past 18 months. I mean, you might see the sort of like scattered environment behind me. I'm up in basically our workshop. I have a little office up here. I'm remodeling it. I'm going to be installing a window behind me. And in any case, moved from San Francisco out to a rural area in Oregon, and have been exploring a number of things here in terms of getting back in touch with land systems. A part of this land was logged a number of times and is in like different phases of regrowth into old growth, and trying to figure out how to help steward that process. And that's basically been a window into a massive amount of learning about ecological systems, and an opportunity for me to map a lot of my work on complex systems into that ecological space. I've been focusing a lot on understanding food systems, growing our own food, just being very close to those processes. I mean, it's kind of fascinating to actually spend the first year. I basically didn't add any water systems, any irrigation systems, or any automation, because I wanted to be out there like every morning, seeing all of these systems evolve and co-interact, and understanding what was going on, getting that sort of closeness, and just practicing the skills of observation and trying to understand the active inferencing process about what's actually going on with weather, temperature, water, density of different plants, plant-to-plant interaction, and just observing that and thinking through it, and then literally consuming the fruits of that labor. And I am talking with some people in the area about regenerative agriculture processes that they're already doing and not getting compensated for. And there are other companies like Regen Network, for example, that I may be working with in the future to help figure out how to bring some of this sort of like process-based integrity that's already going on to an economic model that offers these people compensation for doing what's actually not just good for the land, but also could be good for them economically by mapping up complex behaviors. It's kind of interesting that there's a parallel between what they're doing and what you're doing. Like this idea of there's like a bunch of different processes that could be of high quality that these small farmers are doing, but right now, is there a market for that? Right. Well, if you can tie that to at least at first a carbon market, or a market of people who are willing to pay for these long-term priorities, then you can basically make it visible, and also by making visible, make rewarding economically this whole other certain set of processes. So I'm interested in actually figuring out how that works in my local area, because there's a lot of people who are the perfect candidates for exploring that space. And then there's a project that I've kind of had on pause for a while. I started building a few years ago, but I want to actually get it out there, which is actually associated with basically mapping your values to actions at different types of timescales. So like I still use it personally to help manage my own daily, weekly, monthly life, and manage how that maps to my values over time as well. But increasingly want to start getting some people to give me some feedback on that, and maybe get it out to wider and wider audiences. Because the whole point of that is to figure out, instead of trying to change the world from the top down, how do you look at your own values in your own daily life, and then stitch, like, first of all, balance that in your own set of constraints, in your own time constraints, emotional constraints, energy constraints, to help sort of steward your own evolution and your own increased capacity to take agency in your personal sphere, and then perhaps hook that up to other people in your life, in your family, and then perhaps build that to your community. So taking a very bottom-up approach in terms of providing a tool for people to help steward their own patterns of behavior and how those relate to their values across time. So yeah, that's sort of the spread of things that I'm up to at the moment. In addition to sort of just some research in the domains that I'm constantly interested in with respect to representation and value and money and things of that nature in the crypto space specifically, but also generally.
So, key question, other than MatthewPirkowski.com, where else, is that the main place to find your essays and your work, or is there other places as well?
Yeah, that's the main place. The past few years, I've spent much more time. I kind of go through phases, and I've been in very much a sort of convergent, ingestive phase over the past couple of years, as well as building a few things and then moving and getting married and doing a ton of other life-oriented processes, totally reorienting my daily routines, like in the middle of like nature and a farm as opposed to in a city. So my writing, I haven't been doing as much writing, but getting back into it, and it will be MatthewPirkowski.com. I'm considering either just self-hosting something in the future or doing a Substack as well, where I'll publish this next essay on proof of work, proof of stake. But I'll let you all know before I do that.
That sounds great. And I also would like to see the values mapping that you're working on, because I love the impulse of coming out of abstraction and into the concrete, because I think that's where so much value is created. And it took me forever to learn this because I'm inclined to abstraction, but I'm really easily excited by projects that are about condensing and compressing all of the intellection that happens so easily these days into action and more tangible, concrete things. I just think that's a really cool.
Which is why I built it for myself, because I have that same predisposition towards abstraction. And then I wanted something to really help me understand how to map that onto action. And then not just action like on a calendar, this very hyper-rationalized way, but the whole thing is based around essentially frequencies and trying to figure out how these frequencies interrelate, right? I mean, how frequencies can have constructive and destructive interference, right? Well, it's the same for the different types of things that we want to do in our lives along different dimensions. We have a finite amount of energy and we have a finite amount of attention. And sometimes the things that we want to do can have sort of constructive interference. They can help facilitate one another. And sometimes they can pull against one another. And I was really interested in figuring out how to map that and put it down into action. So yeah, I would love to show that to you.
You're trying to make music out of habits.
Kind of. That's the idea, yeah. And it's been helpful for me so far. It's not quite there, but it's been good so far. And if you're interested in it, I would definitely I'll show it to you. I know Sam and I have talked about it as well in the past, and it's just sort of something that's been in the background, but I really want to start bringing it to the foreground because I've been using it, but I haven't really been sharing it with the world. So.
Looking forward.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, seems like a pretty good place to finish up. Sam, were you going to add something in?
No.
Oh. Yeah, it's a pretty good place to finish up there. Matthew, thanks.
I guess except to just follow
okay.
Matt on.
Yeah, follow Matt on Twitter.
Follow Matt on Twitter. We didn't plug the Twitter, and that's the, at least from my perspective, over the having followed Matt for the past few years and followed some of his work, Twitter is the best place to get his stuff plugged into your head. That's a terrible way
we'll have those. We'll have those links in
downloading Matt's mind.
Well, yeah.
Hopefully, I will increasingly provide maybe less pathological mediums for interacting with my work, lower sort of mimetic radioactivity domains than Twitter. But right now, yeah, that is kind of the primary location where I brain dump when I'm having thoughts that I think should be out there. You have
been trying to branch out, right? You've tried Minds, you've tried a few of these others, but the gravity well that is Twitter, it's just impossible to escape at this point in time. But hopefully there's enough, cultural energy, perhaps with this Joe Rogan thing, who knows what could happen over the next year, that could push us to something that's a bit more, that works a bit better for all of us.
So true. And hopefully something that uses technology to really facilitate and enhance conversation, because that just hasn't emerged yet, and it's so necessary.
Sweet. Well, all those
Jeff Atwood is thinking about very similar things, and we just talked to him last week or 2 weeks ago. Sorry to keep appending things to the end of this,
That's
but
fine.
definitely check out the podcast with Jeff Atwood. He was talking exactly about using software to engineer and encourage better conversations on the internet. I think it's really good intersection.
Yeah, I'll check it out. You said Jeff Atwood?
Atwood, yeah. He's the creator of, the founder of Stack Exchange, and then the creator of Discourse. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
cool.
Yeah. But I'm not trying to like completely just draw a line and shut it down. But I know if one person asks like one question, we're gone. We're gone for another hour. So I'm gonna have to. Thanks to everyone, and Matt especially. Thanks for coming on. This was a really great talk. And everyone be sure to follow the Twitter, go on Matt's blog, and all those links will be in the description. But thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for having me on. Really appreciate it. It's a great conversation.
Great pleasure. See you on Twitter.